Well, good Wednesday, friends. Thanks for taking a moment to join me on this April 13th, the Wednesday of Holy Week. And I want to ask you a question. Actually, I want to ask you if you've heard of somebody. Have you heard of Matea Roach? I never had before this week. I never had. But I'm wondering if you've heard of her. And you may have heard of Matea Roach if you are a Jeopardy fan. So if you watch that game show, that takes place most evenings on TV, you may have heard of Matea Roach. And like I said, I've not heard of her. Actually, I'm not watching TV right now. Hadn't heard of her. But then all of a sudden I started to read about her. And I started to hear about her on the radio. And I thought, who is this lady? I've never heard of her. Turns out that she's been on Jeopardy. She's a Canadian. And she's actually from the Maritimes. And she's actually now won 6 consecutive nights of Jeopardy, which is quite a feat. And so there you have it. If you never heard of her before, now you have. And like I said, she's won 6 consecutive nights of Jeopardy. And I was reading an interview that she did. And it's interesting because in this interview, she had to be very careful. She had to be very careful because although folks are watching this and it's been the last 6 consecutive Jeopardies that she's won, they were taped long ago. And so she knows the end result. She knows how the story ends. But in the interview, of course, she had to be very careful. She can't let anything slip. She can't let it out. She can't let people know how tonight's game is going to go. And so she really, as the interview was being done, she didn't have a whole lot to say, just how happy she was and how she appreciated the support, especially from the Maritimes. And it was interesting. As a part of this interview, they were asking other people that knew her why they were getting so excited. And what stood out to me was a person that said this. They said, well, with all that's going on in the world, we just need good news. We just need good news. And friends, we do need good news. And maybe some people, maybe some of you are Jeopardy fans, maybe you're getting excited, maybe you have no idea what I'm talking about. Jeopardy, what's that? But we need good news, and people are looking for good news. And friends, you may not know who Matea Roach is, but I hope and pray, I pray that you know who Jesus Christ is. Because this week is a week of good news. This is Holy Week, and this is a week when we have good news, we share good news. Easter is all about good news. And I want to say this today. The good news is that Jesus died, and spoiler alert, he rose again. We know the end of the story. Although we don't really know, we will know eventually, the end of Matea Roach's story. She can't reveal, she knows it, but she can't tell it. She has to keep it a secret. She has to keep everyone in suspense. Well, we know the end of the story of Jesus Christ, and that's why we celebrate. That's why we celebrate this week of Easter. Now, just a couple days from now, we have Good Friday. And the events of Good Friday are in many ways, they're just heavy and sad. Thinking about someone dying on a cross, being crucified. And yet it's Good Friday because we know that he rose. We know the end of the story. And I want to read for you today out of God's Word, the good news. I want to read for you out of Mark chapter 9. In Mark chapter 9, this is what we read. Jesus is with his disciples, some of his closest friends. And this is what we read. Leaving that region, they traveled through Galilee. Jesus didn't want anyone to know he was there, for he wanted to spend more time with his disciples and teach them. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies. He will be killed, but 3 days later, he will rise from the dead." They didn't understand what he was saying, however, and they were afraid to ask him what he meant. Jesus knew. Jesus knew that he would be betrayed. He knew that he was going to be killed, crucified, but he knew also, and he shared it with his disciples, that he was going to rise again. He was telling them the end of the story. He didn't want to keep them in suspense. And yet they couldn't understand it. It didn't make sense to them. And if someone maybe came to us and tried to tell us that story too, that they were going to die, but then they were going to come back to life, we might question that as well. They didn't understand. They were afraid to ask questions. and yet we know it to be true. The Bible records it. We celebrate it. That's what Holy Week, the celebration of Holy Week, is all about. The betrayal, the death, and the resurrection, the coming to life, the raising again of Jesus Christ. We know the end of the story. And that is good news. And that is what we celebrate. And here's the thing, friends. Maybe you're hearing this story. Maybe you know it. You're hearing it again. Maybe you haven't heard it before. Wherever you're at, this story is for us. We need to hear this story. We need to know that Jesus is risen. He is risen indeed. We need to know this because not only do we know the end of Jesus' story, but because we know the end of Jesus' story, we can know the end of our story. When we trust Jesus, when we accept his sacrifice, when we seek forgiveness that only comes through him, we can know the end of our story. Again, you'll have to watch Jeopardy to figure out the end of Matea Roach's story and her time on that show. But you can read God's word, and that's what we do this week. We focus on Jesus so that we are reminded again that we know the end of the story and there is victory. And because of the victory that Jesus had over death, we too can have victory over death. We too can be confident how our story will end if we embrace and we trust Jesus. And so on this Holy Week, this most sacred week, I want to encourage you to reflect, to read about the story of Jesus, to understand it. The disciples didn't understand what he was talking about, this idea of being betrayed and killed and rise again. Well, if you have questions today, if you don't understand it, then read more, research more, ask more questions, reach out to us. And if you're celebrating this story as I am, be reminded that this story, because we know the end of Jesus' story, the good news is we know how our story will end too. You see, because Jesus told us how his story would end. He told us how it would all play out, and it did. His word is true. His promises are true, and he's promised for those of us who put our trust in him, who believe that how his story ended, and it's not at all over. In fact, Jesus is waiting for us. And so we can be confident of how our time on this earth will come to an end and where we will be because of Jesus' story. God bless you today. I pray that you take time during this Holy Week to spend it in God's Word, reflecting on the story of Jesus and how that story and how the victory that Jesus had over death can be our victory as well. It can be our story. God bless you. Peace be with you. We do know the end of the story of Jesus and our story.